Les grew up to be a computer scientist, earning a BS in electrical engineering from the California Institute of Technology in 1953, a master's in electrical engineering from MIT in 1960. In 1965, he came to Stanford as a lecturer in computer science and chief administrative officer of the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, or known as SAIL. He left Stanford in 1980 to serve as founding president and director of Imogen Corporation, returned to Stanford in 1985 for a final 3 years as a lecturer and associate department chair before retiring in 1988. There's much, much, much more to Les's professional life. Debbie just surrendered to the temptation and put a link to a website where you can get more information about his professional life. I'm sure his experiences there are a large part of his lifetime learning and forming the man he is today. But my acquaintance with Les began with our common experiences as members of the board of the American Civil Liberties Union chapter, when the chapter that's just north of here, the Mid-Peninsula chapter of the ACLU of Northern California. The ACLU was and is a great fit for Les because he has a lifetime of advocating for causes he is committed to. You cannot spend much time with Les without cycling, getting into the conversation. It is not just an interest, it is a passion. And if you are capable, he'll probably be persuading you to get on a bike next time. I confess to knowing almost nothing, I confess to knowing nothing about the topic that he's addressing this morning, beyond what is in the flyer. And I noticed there Debbie in desperation referred you to with a link there to get information. So like the rest of you, I will be looking forward to being educated and edified by Les's presentation and the Q&A and conversation after his presentation. Join me in welcoming Les Earnest to the podium.
I'm barely making it.
Oh, I'm glad you're making it.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. I apologize. I'm getting over a nasty cold. If I am a little too foggy, please harass me. On the topic for today, I mentioned that the biggest fraud of the 20th century gave rise to many other frauds. I will not have time to go into those. I'm going to focus just on the primary system and the resulting development of the Internet, which was made possible by the SAGE air defense system in an odd sort of way. So let me get on with this. Well, you heard some of my background. I grew up in San Diego, bicycling bad boy. I started building construction at age 3. That is, there was a big fence between our backyard and the next door elementary school, so I could see everything that was going on there, and really enjoyed watching the kids running wild, until one day a cement mixer showed up, and they were starting to build a new kindergarten and needed a foundation. So they were mixing concrete, dumping it in wheelbarrows, hauling it over to the site. That was before cement trucks had been invented. So you had to mix your own concrete. Well, I took one look at that and saw there was an opportunity, since I had recently been given a wheelbarrow, not a very big one. So I went and snatched it out of the closet, went around outside into the site, and volunteered to haul concrete. They poured a few handfuls into my wheelbarrow, and I took it over and dumped it and came back and went back and forth. After a little while, a photographer showed up, and I was in the newspaper the next day as being a volunteer. Well, I also did join the Cub Scouts, but was dishonorably discharged for artistic misconduct. So I never got to be a Boy Scout. I got an FBI record early in World War II as a result of dabbling in cryptography. My best buddy and I got the only book on cryptography available then, read it, developed our own code, typed it up on one page with a carbon copy. There were no copiers back then. And we each carried it with on our persons at all times so that we could exchange coded messages. Never mind that we spent every afternoon together. I eventually was given glasses to wear, which I refused, but I carried them in my pocket, and I decided that was a good place to keep my code sheet, so I folded it up and put it under my glasses. And as luck would have it, on the way back from the beach on the streetcar, it apparently slipped out of my pocket. And my mom contacted the streetcar company, and they got nothing. Excuse me. About 12 weeks later, they showed up to talk to us, the FBI. Apparently they had put 12 agents on this project for many weeks, going to every optometrist in San Diego to get a match on the prescription. Finally succeeded, and were very disappointed to learn that I was only 11 years old, because they thought they had a Japanese spy. This was early in World War II. I later got into CalTech on a scholarship, ran wild and flunked out twice, but still graduated. One of my inspirations there was the chemist Linus Pauling. He was my freshman chemistry teacher, and a very impressive fellow. I chose to major in chemistry as a result, but later flipped. Well, while I was there, I was still generally a troublemaker, and among other things was elected to be Pope of Blacker House, which put me and my College of Cardinals in control of lowering student morals. That was our objective. And we measured progress by administering a purity test twice each year to see how much the scores went down, and succeeded every year. And still somehow managed to graduate. Let's see. To avoid being drafted into the Army during the Korean War, I joined the Navy. I found a program for which I was perfectly matched. You had to have an engineering degree and poor eyesight. If you had good eyesight, you did not qualify. Then you would be an unrestricted line officer, and they'd send you to sea or up in an airplane or something. But since I matched their requirements, it was a perfect fit, and I ended up in computers for the first time. It turned out I was working on flight simulations for manned aircraft and missiles, solving simultaneous differential equations digitally. You also could do that with analog computers, and we had the largest and fastest analog computer in the world called Typhoon, which was built by RCA. But they needed check solutions done digitally, so that was the project I got involved in, and turns out that in the long run, digital computers wiped out analog for most purposes, including that one. Let's see. When I got out of the Navy, I had been following what was going on at MIT somewhat remotely. The Navy had given a bunch of money to MIT after World War II to develop a flight simulator for pilot training. And the idea was to make a general purpose one that could simulate any kind of aircraft. So you didn't have to keep making one for every kind of aircraft as a training device. And they started out doing that with an analog computer called Whirlwind. Partway through, they decided digital was the way to go. So they kept the same name, Whirlwind, and started building digital computers that got quite elaborate. And they invented magnetic core memory, among other things, which was a big advance for computer technology. Up until then, the only kind of random access memory you had were so-called Williams tubes, basically CRTs, where you would put a little charge at one place and come back and flick at it and see if it was there or not. Not nearly as good as magnetic core. And of course, core later got overrun by transistorized memories, but that was like 20 years later. Anyway, the fundamental problem with the SAGE air defense system, as I learned on my first day there, I volunteered to help design SAGE because I knew MIT was a hotbed of digital technology. So when I showed up there the first day, I was assigned to an office with a fellow named Paul Sinesi, and I said, "Well, what do you do?" He says, I work on radar data," in a Boston accent. You take the R off the end of radar and you add it to data. Anyway, so I said, "Well, what do you do about jamming?" He said, "We don't do that." I thought he was kidding, because since World War II, all bombers have had jamming. Turns out he wasn't kidding. What had happened was some professors who were working on this flight simulator project, and it was not going anywhere, had to come up with another way of getting money to keep the project going. And they came up with several ideas. One was air traffic control, that is, they thought they could track aircraft flying all over the country and assist controllers. And that would have worked, but the people in our government were not interested. But they did find Air Force, Air Defense Command wanted to have a air defense system that would track incoming bombers and direct interceptors and missiles to shoot them down. And so that became the SAGE system. SAGE stands for Semi-Automatic Ground Environment. Kind of silly name. And since I had come out of the Navy dealing with various kinds of manned aircraft, they assigned me to design the weapons control function for SAGE. That is, how to direct missiles and manned interceptors to intercept a given moving target. And in any of several tactics, like pursuit, direct intercept, or more commonly, final turn. That is, the aircraft, the interceptor does a turn to come in from the rear, lateral rear on either side of a bomber to shoot at it. That was the most popular. But the fundamental problem was our system couldn't track bombers. And everybody knew that who was working on the project, but it was classified secret so that if anybody mentioned it out loud, you go to jail. That game is still being played large scale today. We have anti-ballistic missile systems being deployed around the world that don't work, never will work, costing gigabucks because this combination of, well, I call it the military-industrial congressional complex, because the way it works is people put proposals together. Makes no difference whether they make any sense at all. But then the industrialists bribe members of Congress. It's legal. It's called a campaign contribution. Get them to fund it, and then you build this system, and the people building it make a lot of money, and we go on from there. Now, SAGE was kept going, even though it never worked from the beginning, it was kept going for 25 years at enormous cost to the public. And for the last 50 years, I've been trying to get that story out in the open without success, because the same crooks control the media to a large extent. I figure sooner or later they're going to try to put me in jail, but getting old enough that there's less opportunity. So it goes on and on. Well, let me keep moving here. SAGE design began in the early 1950s. Okay, now the MIT administration figured out the same thing that I figured out, namely this was a fraud. And they had the good sense to back away in 1958. What they did was those of us who were working on designing SAGE were in a place called MIT Lincoln Lab in suburban Boston. What they did was form a new nonprofit corporation called MITRE, M-I-T-R-E, with no explanation for what that means. And we were all shoved out the door into MITRE in short order. Eventually they built fancy buildings for us to work in. And initially I spent time in an insane asylum and also in an abandoned Nike missile site until we finally got regular structures. Well, we did finish the design, and it got implemented. Now, the design had gone off track in multiple ways by then. For one thing, MIT had strongly recommended that they put these computer centers that were going to control all of the defense underground in remote locations, so they would be less vulnerable. But, well, let me get over to that. Oh, yeah, here's a direction center. Now, there were 23 of these direction centers built. One in Canada that was underground, and 22 spread all over the US, connected to thousands of radars and to hundreds of Air Force bases with manned interceptors and to missile sites that could launch. And it was each floor of that direction center was literally the size of a football field, and then there were 4 floors. Top one was offices. The next one was graphic display terminals, including large screens for generals. Now, incidentally, Hollywood picked up on that. They really liked the idea of a large screen display in a dim room as the place to run a war. So from then on, all war rooms were large screen displays with dim lights. And again, everybody was pretending that it worked. Now, the computer, which literally covers the area of a football field, it was a duplexed computer system, ran on vacuum tubes. And of course, vacuum tubes don't all last forever. So you had to run tests on them occasionally and replace those that are on the way out. So they had then 2 computers, and one would be in use supporting the displays, and the other one was generally in backup mode. They were testing and replacing vacuum tubes and that sort of thing. Now, incidentally, given that this thing ran for 25 years on vacuum tubes, while the US got rid of those things, we switched televisions and everything else to transistors. There came a time when, in order to keep replacing the vacuum tubes on these computers, the US manufacturers no longer made the tubes, but the Russians still did. They hadn't given up on vacuum tubes yet. So we were buying vacuum tubes from them to keep the computer going that was supposed to stop them from attacking us. An absurdity of sorts. Anyway. And then there was also a floor devoted to air conditioning, power supplies, and communication systems. So this was a big-time operation, the whole thing. Now, some of you may have noticed the Mount radar, which was part of the fraud. And a bunch of old Air Force guys got together with the idea of erecting a monument to themselves by refurbishing this crumbling old radar tower. And the Mercury News came out in support of that idea. I repeatedly wrote articles pointing out that the whole thing was a fraud. And nobody was listening. Didn't matter. And our County Board of Supervisors ended up endorsing this plan to preserve the radar tower. Now, happily, there's since been a decision to hand that land over to native people. And so they will have some control over it. And I hope that they rip it out. But they won't try to do that instantly. Anyway, so that's just a local story. Oh, incidentally, at one point, that particular radar tried to get even with me for bad-mouthing it. When I first arrived here in 1965, well, I should say 66, I was installing a big computer at our Stanford lab, which is in the foothills above campus. And we had a very hard time getting everything to work. Finally, well, the air conditioning systems were malfunctioning. Finally, one day, I sent some graduate students out to buy dry ice, which they put under the false floors to cool things down there. And I got some more students to go up on the roof with hoses to water the roof and try to keep it cool. And then we ran the test programs, and it worked. So we finally accepted the computer and started using it for our research program. But a week or two later, it started malfunctioning every 13 seconds, which was kind of strange. We were trying to figure out what's going on here. Finally, one of the grad students came into the computer room with his pocket computer on, a pocket radio on, and it went, let out a buzz at the same time that the computer dropped dead. So that was a clue. It was the Mount radar, 30 miles away, sweeping us, and apparently one of our memory panels was not properly grounded. And so we eventually figured out what the problem was and fixed it. But as I say, the SAGE system did try to get even with me for bad-mouthing it. Anyway, so let me go on. Okay, the Air Defense Command was given choices of where to put these direction centers, and their criteria were good officers' clubs, good golf course, good staff barracks, and when you look around the country, the places that had all of those things were strategic air command bases. They were at the top of the heap on facilities in that era. So many of these sites were put at SAC bases where they were bonus targets. One of the first things any attacking bombers or missiles would go for are our SAC bases. More fundamentally, before SAGE was fully deployed, the threat of a manned bomber attack had been superseded by ICBMs. ICBMs are so much more effective that it would make no sense to launch a first strike with manned bombers. ICBMs were the thing, and SAGE didn't even try to offer a defense against ICBMs. Later, our government has been trying and failing over and over to develop defense against ICBMs, and that just keeps going at great cost. So here are a couple of the weapons. The F-102 was built by Convair for manned interceptors. Now, incidentally, there was a kid named George W. Bush who graduated from Yale in this era, and his daddy arranged to make him a pilot with an F-102 stationed in Houston, which kept him out of trouble in the Vietnam War and all that. Got away with it. Therefore, since I had developed the guidance for manned interceptors, I can claim that I provided early guidance to a future president. If I'd realized what I was doing, I might have offered him a different direction. Anyway, now the Bomark missile had been developed. It was initiated by the University of Michigan and built by Boeing, and so it was deployed as a number of missiles at a given site, all stored horizontally, and when they were to fire, the roof would roll back, the missile would erect, and then launch. That was the way it was supposed to work. Well, as soon as I finished the design work on that, I was appointed head of a study group to obtain permission to use nuclear warheads on Bomark missiles, which was fundamentally an insane idea. But I took them seriously, and I succeeded. I got permission to put nuclear warheads on these missiles, which meant that if we were under attack, we would be launching nuclear warheads in our own skies. And if the bombers were flying low, our Bomark missiles would go down and blow them up and kill everybody on the ground. But that was acceptable to the Air Defense Command because their goal was to stop bombers and they accept collateral damage. So the whole thing was insane. And while doing that, well, in order to qualify for nuclear wars, I had to prove that it would take at least 2 people conspiring to launch one, and also the probability of equipment failures causing a launch had to be less than 10 to the minus very large number. And we were able to prove that. But in the process, we discovered an embarrassing thing. Namely, the command lines from the SAGE Direction Center to the missile site had two routes. In case one went bad, you would switch to the backup line. And when we looked at it, we saw that if one line went bad and you switched to the other one, and if it went bad, you would stay connected to it. Now that meant whatever noise was on the line would be amplified into a string of zeros and ones. So then the interesting question became, how long on average would it be before one of these strings would look like a fire command for one of the missiles on the site? And the answer was about 2.5 minutes. So I wrote a memo, or a report I guess, it was classified, titled Inadvertent Erection of the IM-99A. That was the name of the Beaumark missile. And it went out, and 2 weeks later it happened in New Jersey. What happened, well, our prediction was it would not launch. What would happen is you get a fire command, the roof would roll back, the missile would erect, it would wait for the rest of the guidance commands, altitude, speed, heading, so on. And if it did not receive them within a 5-minute window, it would abort, shut down. And so we were able to prove it would almost certainly not launch, it would abort. But that would scare the hell out of everyone. And that's exactly what happened. So then I was put in charge of fixing that, which turned out to be fairly easy. But that's just an example of the kinds of foolishness that creep into design processes like this for devices that are really dangerous. And we have not fixed that problem. Okay. As you may recall, when Eisenhower left office, his final speech warned about the military-industrial complex. He was being discreet. He didn't mention Congress's role, and he didn't mention the specific system he was talking about. He was talking about SAGE, but did not name it. But nevertheless, it kept going for many years at enormous expense to U.S. taxpayers, and produced no safety at all. Well, let's see. Well, I've already mentioned this business about classifying the deficiencies so that no one may talk about them. And that is operating big time today. Following the SAGE design, I helped design the NORAD headquarters. Excuse me. I'm trying to get over a nasty cold. It's got me fogged up. So at one point they needed an overall command for the SAGE system and put together NORAD, which has people from both Canada and the US. The whole thing was buried in Cheyenne Mountain with a big computer and enough resources that if the rest of the country got blown up, they could all survive and eventually come out. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. Well, let's see. I had here some videos that I don't want to do. But we did get Cheyenne set up. Now, that facility was originally an Air Force base in Colorado Springs. So I then, among other things, had a computer system that tracked all satellites in orbit and also orbiting junk, of which there is a lot. So I used to visit that place occasionally. As soon as Cheyenne Mountain was created and the Air Force people all moved there, they gave their airbase to the U.S. Olympic Committee. And as luck would have it, I was getting up to my neck in bicycle racing at that time, and so kept visiting the same site over and over. Got to know it well. And our main office was put in the room where the satellite tracking computer had been. So I knew it well. Anyway, that's a sideline. Yeah, let me move on here. Okay, I claim that SAGE introduced three major innovations. One was interactive computing. Nobody used interactive computing until then. The standard was batch processing, in which you submit your job on punch cards, and hours to days later, you get the result. Which meant if you made one silly error, it took a long time to get it fixed. So that was grossly inferior. But SAGE introduced a form of timesharing in which hundreds of people could interact with the computer and get instant results from a single computer, and it worked. However, it was very special purpose. And, well, I'll get into that. Well, the other thing is, it developed computer networking at multiple levels. There were like 6 levels of digital packetized communication. And it was a very complex system. Technically it worked. It was a marvel in many ways. But overall, because of the malfunction in radar tracking, and also the fact that it was defending against a threat that no longer existed, namely first strike bombers. It was useless, but kept going. Well, anyway, so these are the three major technological contributions made by SAGE. Now, from there, more work was needed to get to a general purpose network, which we have today. And that happened in several steps. And incidentally, all of this work was done in what I call open source mode. People invented a lot of things that worked. They took no patents. They made it freely available and worked with other people to make the whole system work. And that was what made it work. One of my long-term positions is we should get the hell rid of patents. They are inhibitors of technological advance. But the crooks on Wall Street won't stand for that. So it's a long way off. Anyway, okay, so SAGE was the first computer network, but it was special purpose. The next thing that needed to be developed was general purpose interactive computing, that is, so that you could work on your personal problem without being interfered with by others. And that required that you be given a slice of computer time, and nobody had yet figured out quite how to do that. I tried, as did many of my colleagues. General purpose computer networking came along still later. And then network interconnections. We had the first computer network we had was called ARPANET, and it was very restricted in what it would allow to connect to it. We needed a way to connect to any kind of network and go through to the other side. And that did not yet exist. And we also needed a standardized graphical interface. Okay, now I will badmouth, my colleagues who write computer histories. If you read, I have read literally hundreds of articles and books on computer history. I have yet to find a single one that is both reasonably complete and reasonably accurate. They are generally full of malarkey. And that is primarily, I believe, because journalists find that in order to sell stories, it's more important to tell an interesting story than to tell the truth. And if you can create a superhero, you're way ahead. And unfortunately, this carries over to our local computer history museum. Their exhibit is full of baloney. And I was a founding member. I had given them a whole lot of hardware, and I've donated tens of thousands of dollars to them over the years, hoping that I could get them to start telling the truth. But I have not succeeded because the crooks are their big donors. And they realize I mean, I'm talking about people like IBM, AT&T, General Electric, Convair, Boeing, so on. So they won't touch the truth, like the fraudulence of the SAGE system. They have a big exhibit on SAGE in which they pretend that it worked. I've tried for years to get them to tell the truth. They won't do it. And that's part of a larger problem that we have in our society. Fake history in general pervades our society. And, well, and that comes, I claim, from the fact that we are all born with a lot of fantasies that we inherited from ancient times, and we don't realize that some of our ways of thinking are really fantasies, not reality. And that leads to these serious distortions in history that happen. I mean, 5 billion years ago, our ancestors were all hunter-gatherers. They were leading a really rough life. And they learned a lot about how the world works and got it embedded in their DNA so that their successors would know this stuff right off instead of having to learn it. But they also embedded in their DNA some fantasies that worked. One of them I claim I can prove is that all gods are fantasies. And in fact, they originated only 80,000 years ago, a very short time in evolutionary terms. That was part of a major transformation of one tribe in Africa called sapiens. But that's another subject. I'll talk about that sometime. Anyway, so we have this problem of fake histories that I claim are a product of our fantasies for the most part. Now, following the demonstration of SAGE and our desire to make a general purpose system like that, that would allow us to individually work on projects, a bunch of people tried. One guy who was a recent appointment to MIT, John McCarthy, figured out a way to do it, wrote it up, shared it, and 5 different groups at MIT went for it, and they all worked. So that was revolutionary. And I claim that his invention, which was using interrupts to slice up computer time among many projects, give everybody a short piece, and then on to the next one. That was the biggest invention of the 20th century, I claim, and yet nobody talks about it today. But partly because he did it open source. No patent. This is the way to do it. And it worked. And it is carrying us into a new realm today. Okay. Well,
well, we only have 5 minutes for Q&A.
Okay, well, I guess I don't have to, I could talk a little more about how the other steps were accomplished, But maybe we should just switch over to Q&A.
Okay.
Thank you.
When is your book coming out?
Wait a minute. I had that question also, and you could probably title it, What Happened? But I'd like to ask you, is there an effective missile intercept system now? Does the improved Patriot system work? And how did the Saudi Arabians knock down the missile from Yemen?
Well, for very simplistic ballistic missiles that just go like that, you can shoot them down. But for ICBMs, which go like that is, they throw off multiple warheads in different directions and many fake warheads, so you can't figure out which is the real ones. Our ballistic missile defense systems do not work for that. And we've been working on it ever since the SAGE days, the SAGE beginnings, trying to figure out a defense against them. Not successful.
I really appreciate your opposition to patents, and I think you're correct that the system of giving patents has really gotten out of control to the point where there are biological patents being offered. Do you have any words of advice to people like us who would like to oppose the patent system?
Well, I'll admit to not being very politically astute. I really hope that a movement can be organized to do that. But we first have to blow away Wall Street, which is a serious challenge. I mean, they are in control. And the whole thing is crooked to the core. Among other things, we invented software patents. Now, from the beginning, patents were not to include anything mathematical. But what is software? It is mathematical. It's algorithms. And yet we give patents on this, which is total nonsense. I mean, that's just an extreme case. I claim all patents are basically a way of inhibiting progress. And the big developments of the last 80 years have all come out of open source development, namely networking. So.
Great talk. I really enjoyed it, especially working for Lockheed Martin. I have a couple of questions. One, what I feel that your talk is very relevant today, especially given that the history is written by the rulers, not by the common folks. So those more, the people who do the jobs are not responsible for writing the history, so the history gets distorted. So your message needs to be spread out. That will be my observation, so I really enjoyed it. So my question is, the wind surf is considered the father of internet. Can you comment on that? And also, because you mentioned MacArthur was the one who created that interrupt process in the computer system.
Who was quoted as the father?
Huh? Wind surf.
Wind surf?
Wind surf.
Yeah, from ARPANET.
Well, he did one little piece.
I know, but he's considered in the...
Well, that's part of the baloney. He's a longtime friend of mine.
Yeah.
And he did a good job on putting together the internet protocols. Had to fight like hell with the competition to get them adopted, but he did succeed. And but I would say the most fundamental father of the internet is John McCarthy.
Yeah, that's what I'm finding out today.
Who isn't even recognized by anyone for that. He is recognized for having introduced artificial intelligence. And he was my boss for 19 years.